Hello and welcome. This is Arup Ganguly, a College of Engineering Distinguished Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts, with a joint appointment as a Chief Scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I'm the lead PI for the Sustainability and Data Sciences Laboratory, or SDS Lab, at Northeastern University, and a focus area director at the Institute for Experiential AI. The demo and associated presentation we'll show here pertains to threat detection in soft targets, with a focus on surface transportation, specifically urban metro rail systems. We'd like to thank our sponsors at DHS, DoD, and DOE, especially the Sentry Center led by Michael Silevich at Northeastern. The methods we have been bringing to bear in these broad areas include network science and machine learning, as well as simulations and technosocial process understanding. Let's start with this slide. And what we have here is we have been building a paradigm for risk and resilience, where the various components of risk and resilience, as we understand them, feed back into each other. The broad area that we are targeting, motivation for this comes from the President's National Infrastructure Advisory Council, where they talk about emergency preparedness, including for threat deterrence and soft target, as well as for what are called compound extremes, where threats can happen concurrently or in sequence before the system had had a chance to recover. So here what you're showing is London metro system on the left, and how we have been looking at both fragility as well as restoration when floods and cyber attacks or cyber physical attacks happen either concurrently or in sequence. This paper has been published in Scientific Reports, which is a Nature research journal. Here what we are showing is an interesting study that we did for the Paris Metro Rail. This was just before the Paris Olympics, where there was a desire to sabotage the Olympic ceremony. But instead of going to Paris directly, which was potentially fairly well guarded, the attackers tried to disrupt the flow of traffic at stations surrounding Paris. And interestingly, what the French Prime Minister said at that point was that the incidents were prepared and organized in a way that shows a kind of knowledge of the network in order to know where to strike. We have been developing a publication based on this, led by Sam, which is in review right now. We have been focusing a lot on both understanding fragility of systems subject to attacks, as well as the restoration of this system post-attack. So we have looked at a variety of urban rail systems, including London and New York, but also within the US, DC, Boston, and Chicago, and of course, New York. What we'll show here is a demo that was created by a couple of my former PhD students, Evan Kodra and Udit Bhatia, which shows the New York MTA, Metro Transit, after Hurricane Sandy. So what it shows is that because of the way the restoration happened, the total loss in revenue was about $124 million. And as you can potentially see from here, the recovery process was fairly disorganized. But what we showed is that even if to a first order, we could use an organizing principle for this restoration based on network science, out of that $124 million, we could have saved half that amount. And this is the loss in revenue that happened during the recovery process. So with that, this demo and presentation team will be spearheaded by Dr. Sam Chatterjee, a team leader and chief data scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, with an affiliate appointment as a Northeastern University professor who is an expert in transportation systems and risk analysis. This team includes Dongchin Zhu, a postdoctoral research fellow at Northeastern University with a PhD in transportation engineering from Penn State, a senior PhD student in the SDS lab, and budding entrepreneur Jack Watson, who is leading our new startup called Enodia, as well as Northeastern University computer science master student Orijit Mukherjee and postmasters data scientist Shomode and Karthik Agarwal. With that, let me hand over this virtual podium to Dr. Sam Chatterjee. Sam, over to you, please.
Thank you, Arup. But let's first look at the technology demo and what that entails. So what we have here is a generalizable modeling and simulation capability where we have applied this particular capability to the Boston Urban Rail Network as a proof of concept. And overall, this includes 3 computational modules, machine learning with graphs, where we are leveraging the power of graph convolutional networks in order to generate attractiveness predictions of various targets within the rail network. Network failure simulation module, which includes combinatorial methods to simulate cascading failure sequences and perform what-if scenario analyses, and a network resource optimization module where we have nested defender-adversary optimization methods to inform risk-based network resource allocation. For this particular demo, we're focusing on the first compute module, which is the machine learning with graphs module. And that particular module includes 3 sort of subcomponents or elements. First, we will look at the global terrorism database and visualization of events from historical data. Then we will look at urban rail network data analysis. And finally, rail station attractiveness prediction with graph convolutional networks. So what we see here is essentially historical events. This is global events targeted at rail infrastructure systems. And this data is covering a span of 50 years from 1970 to 2021. And we have also categorized it based on events that occurred prior to 9/11 and post 9/11 with the red and the orange colors. And what we observe is there have been a few thousand events worldwide. And if we want to zoom in a little bit and look at North America, what we observe is that number of events, of course, is much lower in the North American region. And bombing and armed assault seem to be the top categories of events. And then if we zoom even further to the Northeast within the US, we see that number, of course, drops even further. What this sort of provides us is historically, there is a limited number of data or events that are within the US, but globally, this is a much more prevalent problem. And this sort of highlights also the need for us to be able to learn lessons from other events and other locations, but at the same time, focus on the problem within the US and what the implications of that might be if there were an event that occurred in the US. So with that, we will move to the next segment where we start to look at the urban rail network data in the Boston region. So first off, we wanted to look at the urban rail network. So this is the base rail network comprised of 114 nodes or stations and 145 edges rail lines. And the colors here correspond to the 4 different rail lines within the urban rail network. Next, we wanted to be able to visualize various key features and infrastructure elements on top of this rail network. So let's start first by looking at the location of police departments around these stations, and we start to get a sense for where are the regions within the network that have closer proximity to law enforcement and police stations. Also wanted to look at what's the crime pattern around this urban area. So by overlaying the crime density map, this sort of also starts to provide us some inputs and information around, where are neighborhoods that are more prone to crime, and maybe the stations that fall within those neighborhoods may also be susceptible to certain kinds of targeted events. And along with that, we wanted to sort of just to get a baseline understanding first, but then start to look at some network properties of the rail network. So in that regard, we have the ability to display, for example, this one, different network centrality based measures, and be able to rank order the stations based on those measures. So for example, let's look at eigenvector centrality. This is one that provides a high score to nodes that are near other important or highly valued nodes. For example, the French rail sabotage case study that Arup mentioned, where Paris was a high value target or a highly connected target, and then the impacted stations were ones that were one step away or near the high value target. So eigenvector centrality is one that allows us to sort of capture that effect where higher scores go to stations that are connected to other high value nodes. So here we see sort of the color scale providing us with a separation, distinction of certain stations that are likely to be near high-value stations. Similarly, if you look at another centrality metric like betweenness, which sort of characterizes stations that are more frequently visited when trips are made between any two origin and destination nodes. Again, that starts to provide us with a different picture of which stations are more visited along the way from one origin to a destination. So being able to display different centrality metrics and color code the different stations based on that starts to provide us with some information around the value and the properties of these stations, and they may carry different significance when we start to look at them based on different network properties. Next, let's look at some ridership information and data based on ridership, because as we know, different times of the day, the ridership through the network varies. So we want to be able to capture that information as well. And let's first look at a very early morning time window. This is defined by the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority as a time window between 3 a.m. and 5:59 a.m. in the morning. So within that morning time window, here we are displaying the normalized ridership, which overall looks like it's kind of at a lower levels, like not very many people are using the transit network that early in the morning. And we also kind of list out here like the top 10 stations based on ridership. But then when we switch to a different time window, for example, let's say the PM peak time window, which is between 4 p.m. and 6:29 p.m., that picture changes quite significantly, and there are certain, of course, locations near downtown where there is a lot higher levels of ridership and passenger busyness. So being able to look at the network and its usage at different points in the day starts to also provide us with more information around the potential exposure and susceptibility of the network to various kinds of threat events. And then if we were to overlay on top of this level of threat, which is based on crime, that starts to then provide us with information around which locations are potentially at a greater level of susceptibility to various kinds of events versus others. So being able to separate that information is useful. And also being able to overlay the defense posture information on top, which is based on the proximity to neighboring law enforcement and police stations, sort of starts to give us a picture also of the security deployment and the posture from a defense standpoint. So all of these factors and features are important for us to be able to understand in a more holistic manner what is the level of threat, the level of defense, and the potential network properties that play a role in terms of determining how soft targets might get identified and how we may want to channelize and utilize our resources to be able to guard against various kinds of threat vectors. With that, let's go back to the main page and move to the next segment, which is the rail station attractiveness prediction with graph convolutional networks. And before we jump in here, Dongchin is going to provide us with a brief overview of our technology stack. So over to you, Dongchin.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Abhijit. So shown here is the implementation structure of our technology demonstration. And the portion in the red dash box realizes the attractiveness predictions. So data.py here prepares the features from multi-source open data. And these features can be visualized using Python packages, including Folium and PyQt. This demonstration also provides our stakeholders with the ability to modify the threat and defense values based on the use case. Once these values are changed, the features will be fed to the gcn.py, which implements the graph convolution network-based predictions. The updated attractiveness scores will then be visualized using attractiveness.py, which helps our stakeholders see the effects of the threat or defense value changes. These interactions could further help our stakeholders make informed resource allocation decisions. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Dongchin. Arijit, if you want to go back to the demo, what Dongchin described essentially was the sort of the heart and the nuts and bolts in terms of how we generate these attractiveness predictions using a graph convolutional network engine. And here we are displaying what those predicted attractiveness scores are. What we would like to pursue also is display at a very early morning. This is for a very early morning time frame. And as we showed before, if you were to switch that to a PM peak time window, these attractiveness scores change and provide information in terms of the dynamic properties that prevail from a ridership standpoint. Now, within this view, what we wanted to explore further also was picking a station with a low defense, for example, central, and change its defense level to a higher level to see how that might affect its own attractiveness, but as well as the other stations near it. And as we hit simulate, that sort of updates the attractiveness scores for that particular station. So it was initially at low, but now with a defense posture of high, the attractiveness drops down for that station. But then, that also spreads out to the neighboring stations, and we observe changes to the attractiveness in the neighboring regions or the neighboring stations. Sort of this allows us to capture the effect of threat shifting, where maybe if one location is made more secure, that may result in shifting of the threat to other neighboring locations. And this allows us to capture that effect and also to be able to factor that into a resource allocation scheme where we would want to ideally allocate limited resources in a manner that allows for maximal risk reduction. With that, let's end with this demo segment and move towards our next step, where we want to be able to understand risk-informed resource allocation and generate some network failure simulations based on these attractiveness predictions that we see here. So what we see on this slide is essentially some failure simulation runs that we did based on the attractiveness predictions that were generated through the graph convolutional network. And the image on the left is sort of displaying about 12,000 or so simulated network failure sequences, where we were simulating failures of 4 rail stations, one following the other, similar to the French incident where there were 4 stations that were targeted. And these curves, each of these curves corresponds to a particular what-if scenario. And what we sort of display here is, where is the top and the bottom, or what are the bounds in terms of the worst case and the best case settings. And the criteria that we use to run these simulations include, various combinatorial sequences of stations, including also information we got from network centrality measures like betweenness and eigenvector and degree, as well as AM and PM peak riderships, and also the AM and PM attractiveness predictions. So this sort of helps us understand, where are the best case or worst case conditions, which on the right image is where we're sort of displaying where those 4 stations are. The red corresponds to the worst case failure sequence, the blue, the best case. But this is the type of information that can then be useful for us to allocate our resources and understand the risk footprint within our network and be able to secure it against various kinds of targeted attacks. With that, I will hand the virtual mic back to Arup to bring us home.
Thank you so much, Sam. So this demo shows how we have leveraged artificial intelligence and network science under the hood for threat deterrence in surface rail transportation, especially to inform resource allocation and defender decision support, which in turn can lead to metrics and dashboards in urban metro systems. While the specific demo which we presented draws heavily from work done as part of a Department of Homeland Security funded center, synergistic funding sources include the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, NASA, and Northeastern University's Office of the Provost. The stakeholders would include transit authorities, urban planners, defense critical and other infrastructure owners and operators, as well as National and Homeland Security Enterprise. Our Northeastern SDS Lab's prior experience with foundational and translational research, such as patents and successful startups, which also include stakeholder outreach and other entrepreneurial activities, will inform our next steps. Thanks again for listening, and please do not forget to send us your comments. Goodbye.